The burden of consciousness, why awareness might be a curse. The waking nightmare, when awareness becomes prison. What if the thing that makes us human is also the thing that makes us miserable? What if consciousness, this celebrated capacity for self-awareness, this supposedly noble gift that separates us from other animals, is actually a design flaw? A cosmic mistake that condemns us to suffering that unconscious beings never experience? Consider the dog sleeping peacefully in the afternoon sun. It doesn't worry about tomorrow. It doesn't regret yesterday. It doesn't wonder if its life has meaning. It doesn't question whether it's living up to its potential. It simply is. The dog possesses something we've lost, the mercy of unconsciousness. The grace of not knowing. Consciousness is the ability to watch yourself watching yourself. It's the recursive loop that never stops. You're not just experiencing life, you're experiencing yourself experiencing life. You're not just thinking, you're thinking about thinking. You're trapped in a hall of mirrors where every reflection generates another reflection infinitely. This recursive awareness creates a peculiar torture. You can never fully inhabit any moment because part of you is always observing that moment. You can never fully feel any emotion because part of you is analyzing that feeling. You can never fully be anything because part of you is always aware of being. The Buddha identified this as the fundamental problem. The mind watching itself creates dukkha, usually translated as suffering, but perhaps better understood as the inherent unsatisfactoriness of conscious existence. Consciousness is the original sin, not in moral terms, but in experiential ones. Awareness itself is the problem. Ancient Gnostics went further, suggesting consciousness is a trap set by a malevolent creator. We're spirits imprisoned in matter, awareness locked in flesh, sentenced to suffer the weight of self-knowledge. The goal isn't to perfect consciousness, but to escape it entirely. Modern neuroscience inadvertently confirms the burden. Brain imaging shows that self-referential thinking, the kind consciousness enables, correlates with unhappiness. The default mode network, active when we're not focused on external tasks, generates rumination, worry, self-criticism. Our brains, when left to their own devices, torture us. The tragedy is that consciousness can never stop being conscious. You can't unknow what you know. You can't unsee what you've seen. You can't unthink what you've thought. Consciousness is irreversible. Once you're awake, you can never truly sleep again. Once you're aware, you're condemned to awareness. Different animals have different levels of consciousness, and their suffering seems proportional to their awareness. The earthworm probably doesn't suffer existentially. The mouse might suffer physically, but not psychologically. The dolphin suffers more complexly. And humans. Humans suffer in ways no other creature does. We suffer about suffering, worry about worry, fear our own fear. The question isn't whether consciousness has benefits. Obviously, it does. Planning, language, culture, art. The question is whether the benefits justify the cost, whether the capacity to write poetry compensates for the capacity to contemplate your own mortality, whether the ability to love deeply justifies the ability to grieve deeply, whether knowing you exist makes existence worthwhile. The tyranny of self-awareness, the inescapable observer. Self-awareness sounds like a superpower, but what if it's actually a surveillance state you can never escape? You're simultaneously the prisoner, the guard, and the warden. There's nowhere to hide from yourself, no vacation from your own observation, no privacy from your own judgment. Consider a moment of pure experience, biting into a perfect piece of fruit. For the unconscious being, this is simply pleasure, but consciousness intervenes. You think, This is delicious. Already you're one step removed from the experience. Then, I should savor this more. Now you're managing the experience. Then, will I ever taste something this good again? Now you're anxious about the experience. The simple pleasure has been corrupted by awareness. This is the fundamental problem of consciousness. It mediates everything. You never experience reality directly. You always experience your experience of reality. You never feel emotions purely. You feel emotions while simultaneously being aware you're feeling them. This awareness creates distance from immediate experience. The self-aware person carries a critic that never sleeps. You're giving a presentation, and part of you is evaluating your performance. You're having a conversation, and part of you is monitoring how you're being perceived. You're trying to fall asleep, and part of you is aware you're trying to fall asleep, which prevents sleep. Social situations become torture chambers of self-awareness. You walk into a party and immediately become conscious of how you're walking. How do people normally walk? Are you walking weird? Now you're definitely walking weird because you're thinking about it. This cascade of self-consciousness makes natural behavior impossible. The tyranny extends to memory. You not only remember events, you remember yourself remembering events. You remember how you felt while remembering. Each memory is corrupted by awareness of remembering. You can never access the past directly, only your consciousness of the past. Self-awareness creates the imposter syndrome epidemic. When you're constantly aware of the gap between who you are and who you're trying to appear to be, you feel like a fraud. The unconscious person simply acts. The conscious person is always performing, always aware of the performance, always anxious about being exposed. Different philosophical traditions have tried to address self-awareness's tyranny. Zen Buddhism emphasizes beginner's mind, approaching experience without the burden of self-consciousness. Flow states occur when self-awareness temporarily dissolves. The happiest moments are often those where you forget yourself completely. But here's the trap. You can't deliberately stop being self-aware. The moment you try to not think about yourself, you're thinking about yourself. The moment you try to achieve unself-conscious flow, your trying prevents flow. Consciousness trying to escape itself only tightens its own chains. Alcohol and drugs are so popular, partly because they temporarily dull self-awareness. The drunk person isn't monitoring their behavior as carefully. The high person isn't constantly evaluating their thoughts. These substances offer vacation from the tyranny of self-consciousness. Their popularity reveals how oppressive sobriety's awareness can be. Children experience less self-conscious suffering. They can play unself-consciously, feel unself-consciously, exist unself-consciously. But education, socialization, and maturation corrupt this innocence. We teach children to be self-aware, to monitor themselves, to develop that internal observer. We call this growing up, but what if it's really just growing into suffering? The modern emphasis on mindfulness tries to solve the problem by accepting self-awareness rather than fighting it. But even this acceptance requires awareness of awareness, another layer of consciousness, observing consciousness. The recursion never ends. You can't solve the problem of consciousness with more consciousness. The curse of knowing. Why ignorance really is bliss. There's a reason ignorance is bliss became a cliché, because it's devastatingly true. Knowledge creates suffering that ignorance prevents. The person who doesn't know is spared anguish that the knowing person cannot escape. Consciousness gives us knowledge, and knowledge is often poison. Consider the child learning about death. Before this knowledge, life is simple. After, permanent existential anxiety. The knowledge of mortality cannot be unlearned. It infects every moment thereafter. The unconscious animal dies without knowing it will die. The conscious human spends life dying psychologically in advance. Or consider the person who learns their partner has been unfaithful. Before knowledge, happiness, even if based on illusion. After knowledge, retroactive corruption of all past memories, permanent inability to trust, emotional devastation. The ignorant person was living in paradise. Knowledge expelled them. Medical diagnoses demonstrate knowledge's cruelty. The person feels fine, goes for routine screening, learns they have cancer. Nothing physically changed at the moment of diagnosis, but consciousness of disease transforms their entire existence. They were healthy until they knew they weren't. Knowledge made them sick. Scientific knowledge burdens differently. Once you understand factory farming, eating meat becomes ethically complicated. Once you know about climate change, every consumption choice carries weight. Once you grasp economic inequality, every luxury feels like exploitation. Knowledge creates moral burdens unconscious beings never carry. The more you know about anything, the more you suffer about it. The person ignorant of politics is happier than the informed citizen. The person unaware of global problems is happier than the activist. The person who doesn't understand probability is happier than the statistician who sees risk everywhere. Historical knowledge is particularly burdensome. You learn about genocides, atrocities, systematic cruelties. You become conscious of humanity's capacity for evil. You understand patterns that repeat. This knowledge doesn't enable you to prevent future horrors. You're not powerful enough for that. It just makes you aware of horrors, which creates suffering without providing solution. Self-knowledge might be the cruelest knowledge. The more you understand your own psychology, the more you see your patterns, defense mechanisms, self-deceptions. Psychotherapy can make people more aware, but not necessarily happier. Sometimes ignorance of your own dysfunction is protective. The phrase, "what you don't know can't hurt you," is literally true for psychological suffering. Physical dangers might harm the ignorant, but psychological suffering requires awareness. You can't be embarrassed if you don't know you've done something embarrassing. You can't feel inadequate if you don't know others are superior. Consciousness of deficit creates the suffering of deficit. Indigenous peoples encountering Western civilization often experience this curse of knowledge. They gain awareness of material inequalities, of different life possibilities, of their marginalization. This knowledge destroys previous contentment. They become conscious of what they lack, which creates suffering that ignorance prevented. Modern information technology intensifies the curse. You're aware of tragedies globally, constantly. School shootings, natural disasters, wars, suffering everywhere, always. This knowledge doesn't empower you to help. You're helpless before most of it. It just makes you conscious of suffering, adding your secondary suffering to the world's primary suffering. The paradox is that seeking knowledge is intrinsically human. Consciousness drives curiosity. But curiosity often uncovers truths that make happiness harder. The scientist discovering how the universe will end in heat death. The philosopher understanding meaninglessness. The psychologist seeing self-delusion everywhere. Knowledge rewards curiosity with suffering. Plato's cave allegory is usually interpreted as celebrating enlightenment, escaping the cave to see reality. But maybe it's actually a tragedy. The person who escapes is blinded by light, can never comfortably return to the cave, is rejected by those still in darkness. Maybe staying in the cave, ignorant but comfortable, is the better choice. The exhaustion of perpetual thinking when the mind won't stop. The conscious mind is a machine that never turns off. It runs constantly, analyzing, narrating, judging, planning, remembering, imagining. This perpetual activity is exhausting. The conscious person is never at rest. The thinking never stops. The commentary never ends. Try to stop thinking for 60 seconds. Actually try it. Notice what happens. Thoughts arise unbidden. The mind generates content constantly. You didn't ask for these thoughts. You might not want these thoughts, but consciousness produces them anyway, like a factory that cannot shut down. This endless mental chatter creates profound fatigue. People report that their minds are always going. They're tired not from physical activity, but from mental activity. The brain, though only 2% of body weight, consumes 20% of energy. Consciousness is metabolically expensive. The content of perpetual thinking is often negative. Left to itself, consciousness tends toward worry, rumination, self-criticism, catastrophizing. The default mode isn't peaceful contentment, but anxious narration. Your mind tells stories constantly, and they're rarely happy stories. Insomnia reveals consciousness's tyranny most acutely. You're exhausted, desperate for sleep, but consciousness won't release you. Your mind spins thoughts despite your pleading with it to stop. You're being tortured by your own awareness, unable to escape into unconsciousness. The perpetual thinker experiences meta-thinking, thinking about thinking. You notice your thought patterns, judge them, try to change them. Notice yourself trying to change them. Judge that noticing. The recursion creates mental spirals that intensify exhaustion. Decision fatigue demonstrates the cost of conscious choice. Every decision requires mental energy. By end of day, consciousness is depleted from constant choosing. The unconscious being operates on instinct, conserving energy. The conscious being exhausts itself through decision-making. Modern life intensifies thinking's exhaustion. Information overload, constant stimulation, endless options, always-on connectivity. Consciousness must process unprecedented volumes of data. The mind becomes overwhelmed, constantly firefighting attention demands. Different cultures have different relationships with thinking. Western culture celebrates analysis, rationality, intellectual activity. Eastern traditions often emphasize mind quieting, but quieting the mind is extraordinarily difficult for the conscious being. Meditation is hard, precisely because consciousness resists being turned off. The relief of mindless activities reveals our desperation for mental rest. Television, video games, scrolling social media, these aren't just entertainment, they're consciousness anesthesia. They give the exhausted mind something simple to focus on, providing relief from its own complexity. Some people report that their thinking is so constant and intrusive they experience it as mental illness. Obsessive thoughts, compulsive analysis, rumination loops. But maybe this isn't pathology, but just consciousness taken to its logical extreme. Maybe everyone with consciousness experiences this to some degree. The fantasy of turning your brain off is universal, but impossible. You can't switch consciousness off voluntarily, except through sleep, drugs, or death. The very desire to stop thinking is itself a thought. Consciousness is a trap you cannot escape through consciousness. Athletes talk about getting out of your head as essential to performance. When consciousness interferes, monitoring your form, worrying about outcomes, thinking about technique, performance suffers. Peak performance requires unconscious execution. Consciousness literally makes you worse at things. Children think less than adults. They can be absorbed in play for hours, not thinking about anything else. But maturation means increasing mental complexity. More thoughts, more worries, more considerations. Growing up means growing exhausted by your own consciousness. The promise of retirement is often rest for the mind, not just the body. The exhausted worker dreams of not having to think so much, plan so much, worry so much, but consciousness doesn't retire. The mind keeps working regardless of employment status. The prison of choice, how freedom creates suffering. Consciousness gives us choice, and choice is supposed to be freedom. But what if choice is actually bondage? What if the burden of choosing is worse than the constraint of no choice? The unconscious being acts on instinct, pure, simple, unchosen. The conscious being must choose, and choosing is torture. Consider the paradox of choice documented by psychologists. More options don't increase satisfaction, they increase anxiety and regret. The person choosing from 3 options is happier than the person choosing from 30. Consciousness of alternatives creates suffering that would not exist with fewer choices. Every choice carries opportunity cost. Choose one path, lose all others. Consciousness ensures you're aware of what you're sacrificing. The unconscious being that takes the only available path experiences no loss. The conscious being choosing from multiple paths experiences multiple losses for every single gain. Decision paralysis demonstrates choice's burden. Facing important decisions, career, relationship, location, consciousness can freeze. Too many factors, too many outcomes, too much uncertainty. The conscious person becomes paralyzed by their own capacity to choose. Regret is consciousness's creation. You made a choice. It didn't work out. Now you're aware of the better choice you could have made. You replay the decision, torturing yourself with counterfactuals. The unconscious being cannot regret because it cannot compare chosen reality with unchosen alternatives. Responsibility intensifies choice's burden. Because you chose, you're responsible for outcomes. If instinct determined your action, you wouldn't bear moral weight. But consciousness makes you accountable. Your choices define you, judge you, damn you. The freedom to choose is the obligation to bear consequences. Jean-Paul Sartre called this condemned to be free. Consciousness doesn't liberate, it condemns. You must choose, even though choosing is anguish. You must decide, even though deciding is torture. You must be free, even though freedom is burden. The anxiety of authentic choice is overwhelming. When you're conscious that your choices create your life, every decision becomes existential. What career path? Which relationship? What values? These aren't just practical decisions. They're defining yourself through action. The weight is crushing. Modern consumer culture weaponizes choice's burden, endless options for everything, every product in 17 varieties, every service with infinite customization. Consciousness must evaluate, compare, decide, repeatedly, exhaustingly. The unconscious animal has no consumer choices. The conscious human is buried under them. Chooses remorse is epidemic. You chose the restaurant, and now everyone's meal quality is your responsibility. You chose the movie, and if others don't enjoy it, you failed. You chose the vacation destination, and any disappointment is your fault. Choice transforms you into constant defendant. The fantasy of having no choice is secretly appealing. When circumstances dictate action, you're free from choosing's burden. The soldier following orders, the employee executing directives, the person with genuinely no options. They escape choice's weight, and part of us envies them. Political consciousness intensifies choice's suffering. Once aware of political realities, every purchase is a political choice. Every action has implications. Every silence is complicity. You can never just do anything. Every action is evaluated for its ethical and political dimensions. Children have limited consciousness of choice. Their actions feel spontaneous, unconsidered. But maturation brings choice consciousness. Suddenly, you're aware that you're choosing your actions, that alternatives exist, that you're responsible. This awareness is the loss of innocence. Commitment phobia is really choice consciousness, the person aware that committing to one option means foreclosing others. The consciousness of path not taken creates anxiety that prevents choosing any path. Better to keep all options open, even though this itself is a choice with consequences. The analysis paralysis of the conscious mind prevents action. So many factors to consider, so many possible outcomes, so many implications. Consciousness generates information faster than it can process it, creating gridlock. The unconscious being acts. The conscious being deliberates indefinitely. The torture of self-consciousness in social contexts. If consciousness is burden, social consciousness is torture. The ability to imagine what others think of you, to be aware of being perceived, to see yourself through others' eyes. This capacity transforms every social interaction into psychological gauntlet. You enter a room and immediately become conscious of your entrance. How do you look? How should you walk? Where should you look? The unconscious being simply enters. The conscious being performs entrance while simultaneously critiquing the performance. The internal monologue during social interaction is exhausting. You're listening to others while monitoring your own listening performance. You're speaking while evaluating your speaking. You're existing socially while being hyper-aware of your social existence. No wonder social situations are draining. Social anxiety is just consciousness of social performance taken to pathological extreme. But everyone experiences this to some degree. The person who claims they never worry about others' perceptions is either unconscious blissfully or lying, painfully conscious, even of not wanting to be conscious. The spotlight effect, believing others notice you more than they do, demonstrates consciousness's distortion. You're intensely aware of yourself, so you assume others are equally aware of you. But they're too busy being conscious of themselves to properly notice you. Everyone's suffering the same self-consciousness simultaneously. Status consciousness creates perpetual hierarchy anxiety, consciousness of where you rank, who's above you, who's below you, whether you're rising or falling. The unconscious being doesn't know about hierarchies. The conscious being can never forget them. Comparison is consciousness's cruelest tool. You're aware of others' advantages, their looks, success, happiness, talents, relationships. Each awareness of others' superiority creates suffering. The unconscious being cannot compare. The conscious being cannot stop comparing. Social media has industrialized social consciousness. You're not just aware of immediate social circle, but globally conscious of others' curated lives. Consciousness of billions of people living seemingly better lives. The comparison opportunities are infinite, and each comparison wounds. Performance anxiety in any public setting, speaking, performing, competing, is consciousness interfering with ability. The conscious mind monitoring performance disrupts unconscious competence. You know how to do the thing until you're conscious of doing it, then suddenly you can't. The consciousness of being judged is often worse than actual judgment. Your imagination generates harsher criticism than others actually think, but you're conscious of your imagination, which feels as real as reality. You suffer judgments that never actually occurred. Cultural differences in social consciousness reveal its constructed nature. Some cultures emphasize saving face, social harmony, group consciousness. Others celebrate individualism, authenticity, self-expression. But all involve consciousness of social perception, just valued differently. The exhaustion after social interaction, especially for introverts, is consciousness depletion. Maintaining awareness of self, others, interactions, impressions, appropriate responses. It's mentally exhausting. The unconscious being doesn't experience social fatigue because they're not conscious of the social dimension. Authenticity becomes impossible when you're conscious of appearing authentic. The moment you're aware of trying to seem genuine, you're performing authenticity, which is inauthentic. True authenticity requires unconsciousness, which consciousness prevents. The desire to not care what others think is itself consciousness of others' thoughts. You cannot deliberately stop being conscious of others' perceptions. The trying itself is being conscious of what you're trying not to be conscious of. It's a logical impossibility. The weight of memory, consciousness's time-binding curse. Memory is one of consciousness's primary functions, and it's also one of its primary sources of suffering. The ability to remember creates the burden of remembering. The unconscious being lives in perpetual present. The conscious being is haunted by the past. Traumatic memories demonstrate memory's cruelty, most obviously. The event is over, but consciousness preserves it. You re-experience trauma through memory. PTSD is consciousness attacking itself with its own memories. The inability to forget becomes torture, but even non-traumatic memories create suffering. Embarrassing moments from decades ago that suddenly surface, mistakes that can't be undone but can be endlessly replayed, lost opportunities that consciousness preserves in painful clarity. The ability to remember is the inability to escape the past. Regret requires memory. You remember your choice and its outcome. You imagine alternative choices and their possible outcomes. You torture yourself with consciousness of how things could have been different. The unconscious being cannot regret because it cannot remember in this complex way. Nostalgia is memory's seductive suffering. You remember the past as better than it was. You experience longing for what's gone and cannot return. This longing is uniquely conscious suffering. The animal doesn't pine for its youth. Only the conscious being suffers nostalgia. Grudges are consciousness preserving suffering. Someone wronged you years ago. It's over. But consciousness maintains the memory, and with it the anger, the hurt, the desire for justice. You carry this burden not because the wrong continues, but because consciousness continues to know about the wrong. Consciousness's time binding creates existential anxiety. You remember your past extending your identity backward. You imagine your future extending your identity forward. This temporal extension creates the fear of that extended identity ending. The animal lives in present. The conscious human suffers past and future simultaneously. Memory corrupts perception. You don't see things as they are. You see them through remembered experiences. Every new experience is filtered through consciousness of similar past experiences. This prevents fresh perception, authentic experience. You're always living partially in memory. The inability to forget toxic relationships demonstrates memory's prison. The relationship ended, but consciousness preserves every hurt, every pattern, every negative association. These memories infect future relationships. You cannot approach new intimacy without consciousness of past betrayals. Collective memory extends individual suffering to cultural level, consciousness of historical injustices, memory of past conflicts, awareness of generational trauma. These memories create present suffering about past events. The group cannot move forward because consciousness cannot forget. Selective memory reveals consciousness's bias toward negative. You remember criticisms more than compliments, failures more than successes, hurts more than kindnesses. Consciousness seems designed to preserve pain more effectively than pleasure. The fantasy of amnesia is revealing. Many would choose to forget painful memories if possible. But consciousness doesn't allow deletion, only repression, and repressed memories leak back. You cannot escape your own remembering. Dementia, though devastating, offers peculiar mercy. As memory dissolves, certain sufferings dissolve with it. The dementia patient forgets their grudges, their regrets, their anxieties. They're returning to something like unconsciousness. And while we grieve their loss of self, perhaps they're being freed from consciousness's burden. Memory's relationship with identity creates additional suffering. You are your memories, in some sense. So forgotten memories are small deaths of self, but remembered painful memories are preservation of painful selves. You cannot win. Forgetting and remembering both create suffering. The consciousness that you're forgetting is its own suffering. The name you can't recall, the experience that's fading, the person you're losing track of. Consciousness of memory's failure creates anxiety that the unconscious being never experiences. The paradox of progress. Why civilization increases consciousness and suffering. Human civilization is the story of increasing consciousness and therefore increasing suffering. Each technological advance, each social development, each cultural evolution makes us more conscious and more miserable. Progress in civilization is regression in peace. Consider the hunter-gatherer, limited consciousness of future, no awareness of global events, no complex social hierarchies, no existential questions about life's meaning. Studies suggest they worked fewer hours and experienced less stress than modern humans. Unconsciousness was protective. Agriculture began increasing consciousness. Now you must plan seasons ahead, store surplus, develop property consciousness, create hierarchies of ownership. Agriculture made civilization possible and made peace impossible. Writing intensified consciousness exponentially. Now knowledge persists beyond individuals. History becomes conscious memory. The literate person carries consciousness of past civilizations, past mistakes, past horrors. Ignorance of history was happier. Cities concentrate consciousness. You're aware of thousands of others, their status, their lives, their judgments. The village person knew dozens of others. The city person knows of millions. This expanded consciousness creates expanded comparison, competition, anxiety. Industrial revolution mechanized time consciousness. Clock time replaced natural rhythms. You became conscious of every hour, every minute. The factory worker's consciousness is bound to time in ways the farmer's never was. Productivity consciousness is suffering consciousness. Mass media created consciousness of global events. You're aware of distant tragedies, remote conflicts, far-off disasters. Television brought suffering into living rooms. Internet brought it into pockets. Constant consciousness of world suffering adds to personal suffering. Social media represents consciousness's nightmare evolution. You're conscious of everyone's curated lives, everyone's achievements, everyone's happiness, everyone's superiority in some dimension. And you're conscious of being conscious of this, judging yourself for judging others. Consumer capitalism requires consciousness of lack. You're made conscious that you need what you don't have, that others have what you don't, that happiness requires consumption. This manufactured consciousness creates artificial suffering that drives economic growth. Medical advances paradoxically increase suffering. You're conscious of every health risk, every potential disease, every preventable death. Medical consciousness creates health anxiety epidemic. The person ignorant of medical possibilities is healthier psychologically. Educational expansion makes more people conscious of more things. You're taught history's horrors, science's depressing truths, philosophy's disturbing questions. Education is consciousness expansion, which is suffering expansion. Ignorance is systematically destroyed. Technology promises to reduce suffering but increases consciousness, which increases suffering. Every convenience creates new awareness of inconvenience when convenience fails. Every tool creates consciousness of inefficiency. Every connection creates consciousness of disconnection. The conscious person in developed society is aware of climate catastrophe, political dysfunction, economic inequality, social injustice, health risks, career precarity, relationship fragility, existential meaninglessness, mortality certainty. The unconscious village person in past centuries was aware of this season's weather, this week's food, this day's tasks. Who was happier? The developed world person, with every material comfort and crushing consciousness, or the traditional world person, with minimal material comfort and minimal consciousness. Progress created material abundance and psychological poverty. We cannot return to unconsciousness. Knowledge cannot be unlearned. Consciousness cannot be reversed. We're trapped in the world we've created, increasingly conscious, increasingly miserable, calling it progress. The illusion of control, how consciousness creates false agency. Consciousness creates the powerful illusion that you're in control, that you're authoring your thoughts, deciding your actions, directing your life. But what if consciousness doesn't create control, but only consciousness of processes that would happen without it? What if awareness of control is worse than actual lack of control? Neuroscience reveals uncomfortable truths. Brain activity precedes conscious awareness of decisions by several seconds. Your brain decides before you're conscious of deciding. What you experience as free choice is consciousness observing pre-conscious processes. You're not the author, you're the narrator pretending to be the author. The planning fallacy demonstrates consciousness's false agency. You consciously plan, but your predictions are consistently wrong. Your conscious self believes it's in control, but unconscious factors dominate outcomes. Consciousness creates elaborate illusion of agency while lacking actual control. Consciousness of control creates responsibility for things you don't actually control. You feel responsible for your thoughts, but you don't choose what thoughts arise. You feel responsible for your feelings, but emotions arise unbidden. You feel responsible for outcomes, but countless factors beyond awareness determine results. The burden of perceived agency is crushing. Because consciousness believes it's in control, it believes it's responsible for everything. Your failures are your fault. Your life's quality reflects your choices. Your suffering indicates your inadequacy. These beliefs create suffering that acceptance of uncontrol would prevent. Different philosophical traditions have recognized consciousness's control illusion. Buddhism teaches that self-control is illusion. There's no controller, just processes. Taoism emphasizes wu-wei, action through non-action, spontaneity without conscious effort, surrender to what is rather than illusion of controlling what isn't. The exhaustion of trying to control is profound. You try to control your thoughts, they proliferate. You try to control your emotions, they intensify. You try to control outcomes, they resist. The conscious effort to control often makes things worse. Anxiety is largely consciousness's control illusion failing. You're conscious that you should be able to control something, your thoughts, your body, your situation, but you can't. This gap between imagined control and actual uncontrol creates anxiety. The unconscious being doesn't expect control, so doesn't suffer its absence. Addiction demonstrates consciousness's control failure dramatically. The conscious self wants to stop, tries to stop, promises to stop, but unconscious drives dominate. The addict experiences the horror of consciousness without control, aware of inability to control themselves. The meditation practitioner discovers that controlling the mind is impossible. You cannot force thoughts to stop. You cannot command emotions to change. You cannot will yourself into peace. True meditation is accepting lack of control, which consciousness resists fiercely. Control anxiety pervades modern life. You should control your diet, your schedule, your productivity, your relationships, your career, your mood, your life. Consciousness creates endless list of things you should control but cannot. This creates constant low-grade failure experience. Paradoxically, accepting lack of control often produces better outcomes than attempting control. The person who stops trying to control their insomnia often sleeps better. The artist who stops trying to control their creativity produces better work. Consciousness's control efforts often sabotage what they're trying to achieve. The illusion of control becomes dangerous in complex systems. You're conscious of making decisions, so you believe you control outcomes. But in complex systems, societies, economies, ecosystems, control is largely illusion. Consciousness's false confidence creates catastrophic overreach. Children possess less consciousness of control. They're more spontaneous, less self-regulating, more authentic in expression. But maturation means increasing consciousness of control, learning to manage behavior, regulate emotions, present socially acceptable selves. Growing up is growing into the illusion of control and its accompanying anxiety. The terror of meaning-making, consciousness, and existential dread. Consciousness doesn't just make us aware that we exist, it makes us aware that existence might be meaningless. The capacity to ask why, consciousness's supposedly noble achievement, creates existential terror that the unconscious being never experiences. Meaning, consciousness is suffering. The unconscious being simply is. It doesn't wonder why it exists. It doesn't question its purpose. It doesn't suffer the thought that its existence might be pointless. Consciousness created these questions, then discovered it cannot answer them satisfactorily. Every meaning system humans create reveals the desperate attempt to escape meaninglessness consciousness reveals. Religion, philosophy, ideology, career, family, all constructed to provide answers to questions consciousness raised, but the construction is visible, which undermines conviction. The consciousness that your meaning is chosen, not discovered, creates vertigo. If you choose your values, they're arbitrary. If your purpose is constructed, it's not essential. Consciousness reveals the scaffolding while you're trying to believe in the building. Sisyphus pushing his boulder demonstrates consciousness's curse. The unconscious being pushing a boulder would just push. But conscious Sisyphus knows it's pointless, that the boulder rolls down, that the task never ends. Consciousness transforms simple action into existential torture. Different philosophical responses to meaninglessness reveal consciousness's struggle. Nihilism, nothing matters. Existentialism, create your own meaning. Absurdism, embrace meaninglessness. Religion, meaning exists transcendently. Each response is consciousness trying to manage consciousness's own revelation. The midlife crisis is often consciousness of meaning's failure. The structures you built, career, family, identity, suddenly seem arbitrary, insufficient, even absurd. Consciousness breaks through the meaning-making, revealing the void beneath. This is psychological crisis that unconscious being never experiences. Modern loss of traditional meaning structures intensifies the crisis. Religion's decline, communities' dissolution, grand narratives collapse. Consciousness must now manufacture meaning individually. This atomized meaning-making is exhausting and unconvincing. The youth struggling with what to do with my life is suffering consciousness's meaning problem. The unconscious being doesn't need life direction. It simply lives. The conscious being requires justified existence, purpose, significance. This requirement creates suffering. Mortality awareness intensifies meaning crisis. If you die and everything ends, what's the point? Consciousness of death makes consciousness of meaning urgent and ultimately unsatisfiable. The search for meaning that transcends death is consciousness trying to escape its own knowledge of endings. The hedonic treadmill, adapting to any positive change, always wanting more, is consciousness's meaning failure. You achieve the goal that was supposed to provide meaning. Consciousness briefly feels satisfied, then adjusts, requires new meaning. The meaning you created cannot sustain you because consciousness knows you created it. Viktor Frankl argued that meaning-making is essential to survival, but maybe consciousness's need for meaning is itself the problem. The unconscious being survives without existential justification. Only conscious beings require meaning for continued existence. The proliferation of self-help, coaching, therapy, spiritual seeking, all represent consciousness desperate for meaning. Industries built on consciousness's inability to accept simple existence. The search itself creates suffering it promises to relieve. Children don't suffer existential meaninglessness. They exist unself-consciously, absorbed in play, present in experience. But maturation brings consciousness of meaning questions. Adolescence's turmoil partly reflects consciousness discovering the meaning problem, searching for answers that don't exist. The loneliness of being conscious, the isolation of awareness. Consciousness creates profound loneliness, not just social isolation, but existential isolation. You're trapped in subjective experience that cannot be directly shared. You're aware of your awareness in ways others cannot access. You're fundamentally alone in your consciousness, and consciousness ensures you know it. You can never truly know another's experience. They describe their consciousness, but you experience only your own. The gap between consciousnesses is unbridgeable. Every connection is ultimately between separate islands of awareness that can signal but never merge. The inability to share consciousness creates desperate communication attempts. Language, art, intimacy, all trying to bridge the gap, all ultimately failing. You're most lonely when trying to connect and realizing full connection is impossible. Consciousness knows this impossibility while still longing for the impossible. The consciousness that others are conscious creates peculiar loneliness. You're aware others have rich internal lives, but you're locked out. You imagine their experiences, but imagination isn't access. Everyone is fundamentally alone in consciousness, and consciousness makes this loneliness visible. Social connection reduces loneliness only partially. You can be surrounded by others and still be lonely in your consciousness. The party where everyone seems connected, but you feel isolated. The marriage where you share a bed, but not consciousness. Being with others highlights rather than eliminates consciousness's essential isolation. Consciousness's loneliness intensifies with intelligence. The smarter you are, the less likely others fully understand your thoughts. The more complex your consciousness, the more isolated you are. Intelligence is consciousness elaborated, which is loneliness intensified. Neurodivergence reveals consciousness's variations, creating isolation. The autistic person, conscious differently. The depressed person whose consciousness is colored by depression. Each variation creates loneliness, consciousness aware it's different from other consciousnesses. The dying person experiences ultimate loneliness. Death is the threshold consciousness crosses alone. Others can accompany to the edge, but not through it. Consciousness knows this, and the knowledge creates existential loneliness even in supported death. Technology promises connection, but often intensifies consciousness's loneliness. You're aware of thousands of others through social media, but connection is shallow. Digital consciousness display is curated, not authentic. The more connected you are digitally, the more aware of genuine connection's absence. Consciousness that you're being observed without being truly known creates particular loneliness. People see your behavior, hear your words, but don't access your consciousness. You're visible but not known, which is lonelier than invisible. The inability to escape your own consciousness creates loneliness, even in solitude. You're stuck with yourself constantly, your thoughts, your patterns, your neuroses. The company of your own consciousness becomes oppressive. Moments of connection, genuine understanding with another, are precious precisely because consciousness knows how rare they are. The friend who truly understands the lover who sees you accurately. These moments of bridge between consciousnesses prove the rule of usual isolation. Meditation traditions promise liberation from consciousness's isolation through dissolution of self-other boundary, but this requires transcending ordinary consciousness, which most cannot sustain. Normal consciousness returns, and with it, the loneliness. The problem of other minds, consciousness contemplating consciousness. Consciousness creates the philosophical problem of other minds. How do you know others are conscious? You're certain of your own consciousness, but you infer others' consciousness from their behavior. This inference is necessary but unverifiable, which creates peculiar anxiety. The zombie thought experiment. Imagine beings who behave exactly like humans, but have no inner experience, no consciousness. How would you detect them? You couldn't. This possibility, however remote, reveals consciousness's troubling privacy. You assume others are conscious like you, but you cannot know. This uncertainty creates existential loneliness. Maybe you're the only consciousness. Maybe others are unconscious biological machines. Consciousness contemplating consciousness in others but unable to verify. Solipsism isn't just philosophical thought experiment, it's consciousness's genuine anxiety. Consciousness's variation between individuals creates additional uncertainty. Is my experience of red the same as yours? Is my pain like your pain? Is my joy like your joy? We use same words but might have entirely different conscious experiences. Communication assumes shared consciousness, but cannot verify it. The hard problem of consciousness, why does subjective experience exist at all, reveals consciousness contemplating its own inexplicability. How does matter become mind? How do neurons become experience? Consciousness trying to explain consciousness is like eyes trying to see themselves. Animal consciousness creates moral and epistemological problems. Is the dog conscious? The rat? The fish? The insect? Consciousness unsure where consciousness begins and ends. This uncertainty shapes how we treat other beings. Consciousness's presence or absence determines moral status. AI consciousness is consciousness's newest problem. As machines mimic consciousness convincingly, how do we know if they're truly conscious or sophisticated imitation? Consciousness confronting possibility that non-biological systems might be conscious, undermining assumptions about consciousness's nature. The consciousness that consciousness might be illusion is particularly destabilizing. Some philosophers argue consciousness doesn't exist as we think, that it's folk psychology, brain's narrative, interpretive overlay consciousness doubting its own existence is consciousness's ultimate recursive problem. Different cultures conceptualize consciousness differently, suggesting consciousness's experience might be culturally shaped. Western emphasis on individual consciousness, Eastern emphasis on consciousness's illusory nature, indigenous emphasis on consciousness's connection to nature. Is consciousness universal or culturally constructed? Altered states of consciousness, psychedelics, meditation, mental illness, reveal consciousness's variability within single individual. Which conscious state is real? Is normal consciousness more valid than altered states? Consciousness discovering it has no stable form. The consciousness of being conscious creates infinite regress. You're aware of being aware. You're aware of being aware of being aware. Where does this recursion end? Consciousness spiraling into itself, unable to find ground. Others' consciousness can seem threatening. Their different thoughts, perspectives, experiences challenge your conscious certainty. The more you're aware of radical difference in others' consciousness, the less secure your own seems. Consciousness destabilized by consciousness of consciousness's multiplicity. The biological mistake, consciousness as evolutionary accident. What if consciousness is evolutionary overshoot? What if the adaptive advantage of basic awareness escalated into conscious self-awareness that creates more problems than it solves? What if consciousness is biological mistake that we're stuck with? Evolution selects for reproductive success, not happiness. Consciousness might increase evolutionary fitness while decreasing well-being. The anxious, depressed, neurotic conscious human reproduces despite psychological suffering. Evolution doesn't care about consciousness's burden. Basic awareness has obvious advantages, detecting danger, finding food, navigating environment, but self-awareness, consciousness of consciousness might be accident without adaptive purpose. Perhaps it's byproduct of brain complexity needed for other functions. The capacity for abstract thought, temporal projection, symbolic reasoning, these conscious abilities solved immediate problems, but created meta-problems, consciousness of mortality, existential dread, meaning crisis. The solution became the problem. Language development likely drove consciousness expansion. Communicating complex ideas required sophisticated consciousness. But language also created ability to worry about future, regret past, imagine alternatives. Communication tools became consciousness torture instruments. Social living required consciousness of others' minds, theory of mind, perspective taking, empathy. These capacities enabled cooperation, but also created social anxiety, status competition, hierarchical consciousness. The price of social cohesion was psychological suffering. The conscious human compared to other animals seems less happy. Wild animals appear more present, more peaceful, more psychologically healthy than modern humans. We're smarter, but more miserable. Consciousness increased intelligence at cost of contentment. Psychiatric disorders might be consciousness gone wrong. Depression is consciousness turned against itself. Anxiety is consciousness imagining danger. OCD is consciousness locked in loops. Schizophrenia is consciousness fragmenting. Mental illness is consciousness malfunctioning because consciousness itself is malfunction. If consciousness is evolutionary mistake, we cannot unmake it. Evolution doesn't reverse. Consciousness cannot devolve back to unconsciousness. We're trapped in this mistake, unable to escape except through individual death or species extinction. Some transhumanists propose we could engineer consciousness differently, enhance desirable aspects, eliminate suffering components. But consciousness's integrated nature might prevent selective modification. Changing consciousness might destroy consciousness. The question becomes, would it be better if consciousness never evolved? If humans remained at animal consciousness level, aware but not self-aware, we wouldn't have created civilization, but we also wouldn't suffer existentially. Which is preferable? Antinatalists argue creating new conscious beings is unethical because consciousness inevitably suffers. Birth is condemning another consciousness to suffering. If consciousness is mistake, reproducing continues the mistake. Extinction would be mercy. The cultural amplification, how society weaponizes consciousness. If individual consciousness creates suffering, social consciousness multiplies it. Culture takes consciousness's natural burdens and amplifies them systematically. Society isn't just a collection of conscious individuals. It's apparatus that weaponizes consciousness against itself. Social comparison is culturally manufactured consciousness. Status hierarchies make you conscious of your rank. Social media makes you conscious of everyone's achievements. Consumer culture makes you conscious of what you lack. These aren't natural consciousness. They're cultural consciousness deployed to create suffering. Shame is culturally constructed consciousness. Natural guilt might be evolutionary, consciousness of harming others. But shame, consciousness of yourself as fundamentally defective, is cultural creation. Society teaches you to be conscious of inadequacy that serves social control. Body consciousness is culturally amplified. Natural body awareness becomes pathological self-consciousness through cultural beauty standards, diet culture, fitness obsession. You're made conscious of every body flaw that culture defines. This consciousness didn't exist until culture created it. Productivity consciousness is cultural weapon. Capitalism requires you to be conscious of your output, your efficiency, your value. Time is money makes you conscious of every moment's economic dimension. This consciousness serves economic system while making you miserable. FOMO, fear of missing out, is consciousness of alternatives systematically amplified. Social media shows you everything you're not doing, everywhere you're not going, everyone you're not being. This consciousness of life not lived creates suffering that serves platform engagement. Imposter syndrome is professional consciousness of inadequacy. You're made conscious that you might not deserve your position, that others are more qualified, that you'll be exposed. This consciousness is culturally produced to ensure compliance and prevent confidence. Educational systems amplify consciousness of intellectual inadequacy. Testing, grading, ranking, making you conscious of how your intelligence compares to others. This consciousness creates anxiety that drives competition while producing suffering. News media amplifies consciousness of danger. You're made aware of every threat, every tragedy, every reason for fear. This consciousness keeps you anxious and engaged, serving media business model while degrading mental health. Advertising creates consciousness of lack. You were fine until advertisement made you conscious you need this product. Marketing is systematic manipulation of consciousness to create artificial suffering that consumption supposedly relieves. Cultural narratives about success amplify consciousness of failure. Follow your dreams. Be your best self. Maximize your potential. These messages make you conscious that you're falling short, that you should be doing more, achieving more, being more. The cult of authenticity creates consciousness of inauthenticity. You must be true to yourself, but consciousness knows the self is performance. You're made conscious of failing to achieve the impossible, unconscious authenticity through conscious effort. Cultural differences reveal consciousness's cultural construction. Honor cultures amplify shame consciousness. Achievement cultures amplify inadequacy consciousness. Collectivist cultures amplify group consciousness. Each cultural system weaponizes consciousness differently. The relief that never comes. Why consciousness can't solve its own problems. The conscious being recognizes consciousness's burden and tries to solve it with more consciousness. But consciousness trying to fix consciousness is like using fire to put out fire. The solution intensifies the problem it promises to solve. Thinking about overthinking is still overthinking. Consciousness of consciousness's excessive activity adds another layer of consciousness. You notice you're anxious, which makes you anxious about being anxious. The observation becomes part of the problem. Self-improvement is consciousness trying to perfect consciousness, but this creates impossible standards consciousness cannot meet. You're conscious you should be better, which makes you conscious of inadequacy, which requires more improvement. The cycle is endless. Mindfulness, often proposed as consciousness solution, is actually consciousness intensification. You become more aware of thoughts, more conscious of emotions, more present to experience. This can be valuable, but it's not escaping consciousness. It's consciousness more fully deployed. Therapy involves becoming more conscious of patterns, of history, of psychology, healing through consciousness expansion. But sometimes this creates more problems than it solves. You're now conscious of all the ways you're damaged, which is new suffering. Positive thinking tries to use consciousness to override consciousness. Think better thoughts to feel better. But consciousness knows you're trying to manipulate yourself, which undermines the manipulation. Forced positivity adds guilt about negative feelings to the negative feelings. Trying to stop caring what others think makes you more conscious of caring. Don't worry about it is instruction consciousness cannot follow. The effort to not be conscious of something makes you more conscious of it. Meditation practice reveals consciousness's resistance to its own quieting. You sit to calm the mind. The mind proliferates thoughts about calming the mind. You're conscious of failing to be less conscious, which is double consciousness. Pharmaceutical interventions numb consciousness, but don't eliminate it. Antidepressants, anti-anxiety medications, they modulate consciousness, but you're still conscious, now conscious of being medicated, of depending on chemicals, of not being naturally okay. Existential philosophy tries to think its way out of existential problems consciousness created, but this is consciousness spinning in place. You cannot think your way out of problems caused by thinking. The fantasy of just be present or live in the now assumes consciousness can choose to not project into past or future. But consciousness cannot simply stop its temporal functioning. Consciousness is temporal by nature. Acceptance practices, accepting thoughts, accepting emotions, accepting situations, are consciousness accepting consciousness, which is still consciousness. The accepting is another conscious act, another layer of awareness. Escape attempts reveal consciousness's prison. Alcohol, drugs, sex, adrenaline, work, entertainment, all temporary consciousness dampeners. But consciousness returns, often with additional consciousness of dependence on escape mechanisms. The only reliable consciousness relief is unconsciousness, sleep, and ultimately death. Everything else is consciousness trying to manage consciousness, which cannot fundamentally solve consciousness's problem of being conscious. The myth of enlightenment, consciousness promising its own transcendence. Eastern spirituality promises consciousness transcendence, enlightenment, awakening, liberation. But what if these are just consciousness creating new hierarchies where consciousness of enlightenment becomes new suffering? The enlightenment promise, through practice, consciousness transcends itself. You become conscious without suffering, aware without burden, present without anxiety. But this might be consciousness's cruelest trick, promising escape while ensuring continued entrapment. Spiritual seeking is consciousness dissatisfied with consciousness seeking better consciousness. The dissatisfaction drives the seeking, but seeking is consciousness intensified. More awareness, more effort, more striving. The path itself contradicts the destination. The conscious person practicing meditation to escape consciousness. The contradiction is built in. How can conscious effort produce unconscious ease? The trying prevents arriving. Consciousness cannot use consciousness to transcend consciousness. Enlightenment hierarchies create spiritual comparison consciousness. You're conscious of how unenlightened you are compared to teachers, how little progress you're making, how far from awakening you remain. Spiritual practice becomes new anxiety source. The consciousness that you're seeking enlightenment is itself unenlightened consciousness. The seeker is the problem. But consciousness cannot stop being seeker without ceasing to seek, which means never finding the koan is designed to break consciousness, but consciousness persists. Different traditions promise different consciousness transformations. Buddhism's nirvana, Hinduism's moksha, Christianity's salvation. But these might be consciousness creating fantasy escapes from consciousness hope as coping mechanism rather than reality. Spiritual bypassing is using consciousness of spirituality to avoid consciousness of problems. You're transcending ego rather than addressing trauma. You're being present rather than making needed changes. Consciousness hiding from consciousness behind consciousness. The proliferation of spiritual teachers, techniques, traditions reveals that nothing reliably works. If enlightenment were achievable, there'd be clear path with consistent results. Instead, endless variation suggests consciousness chasing its own tail. Psychedelic enlightenment experiences are consciousness temporarily altered, not transcended. The mystical experience is still experience, still consciousness. When ordinary consciousness returns, so does suffering. Temporary escape isn't permanent transcendence. The few claiming enlightenment demonstrate consciousness hasn't been transcended. They're conscious of being enlightened. They teach enlightenment. They maintain enlightened identity. All consciousness activities, the supposedly transcended self persists. Maybe enlightenment is just consciousness becoming comfortable with itself rather than transcending itself. Not escape, but acceptance. But this transforms enlightenment from radical promise to modest adaptation. The spiritual marketing doesn't match the actual product. The future of consciousness, technological salvation, or deeper trap. Technology promises to solve consciousness's problems. Brain-computer interfaces, consciousness uploading, AI integration. But what if these technologies just create new forms of consciousness suffering? Transhumanists envision editing consciousness, removing suffering components, enhancing desirable aspects. But consciousness might be an integrated system. Removing suffering might remove consciousness itself. The cure might kill the patient. Consciousness uploading, digital immortality, sounds like escape from consciousness's burdens. But digital consciousness would still be consciousness, still aware, still experiencing time, still potentially suffering. Just suffering in silicon rather than carbon. Brain-computer interfaces promise enhanced consciousness, expanded memory, direct knowledge access, mental telepathy, but these are consciousness amplifications. More information means more to be conscious of. Enhanced consciousness means enhanced suffering potential. AI integration might create hybrid consciousness, part human, part machine. But this is new consciousness form, not consciousness transcendence. The hybrid would face consciousness problems humans face, plus new problems of consciousness distributed across substrate types. Virtual reality offers consciousness escape into designed worlds, but you're still conscious in VR, still aware it's not real, still ultimately unsatisfied. VR might be consciousness distraction, but not consciousness solution. Neuroscience might decode consciousness completely, understanding every mechanism, but understanding doesn't eliminate. You could be perfectly conscious of how consciousness works while still suffering consciousness's burden. Knowledge of prison doesn't equal escape from prison. Genetic engineering could theoretically create humans with modified consciousness, less anxious, more present, naturally happy. But this is consciousness designing new consciousness. The new consciousness would still be consciousness, just different consciousness. Pharmaceutical advances might create perfect medications, consciousness without suffering, but this is chemical consciousness modification, dependency on external substances, new consciousness problem replacing old consciousness problems. The singularity, AI surpassing human intelligence, might make human consciousness obsolete. But this is extinction, not solution. If AI replaces humans, human consciousness problem is solved by eliminating human consciousness entirely. Digital twins, AI versions trained on your consciousness data, might outlive you. But these are consciousness simulations, not you. Your consciousness still ends at death. The simulation doesn't preserve your consciousness. It creates new consciousness that resembles yours. Maybe technology cannot solve consciousness because consciousness is the problem technology cannot address. Technology operates in objective space. Consciousness is subjective experience. The domains don't map. Technical solutions to phenomenological problems are category errors. The gift of the unconscious, what we lost when we woke up. Before consciousness, there was peace. The animal exists without existential dread. The plant grows without anxiety about growing. The unconscious being simply is. What we gained in awareness, we lost in ease. The unconscious being doesn't worry about tomorrow because it doesn't conceive of tomorrow. Doesn't regret yesterday because it doesn't reflect on yesterday, doesn't question existence because it doesn't question. This isn't ignorance. It's natural state consciousness corrupted. Children are closer to unconsciousness. They live in immediacy we've lost, absorbed in play without consciousness of playing. experiencing joy without analyzing joy, being without becoming conscious of being. We educate them into consciousness, calling it development, but producing suffering. Sleep is consciousness's nightly mercy, 8 hours of non-consciousness, consciousness's brief vacation from itself, the unconscious restoration that makes conscious living tolerable. Without sleep's unconsciousness, conscious existence would be unbearable. Flow states, deep absorption in activity, are temporary returns to unconsciousness. Consciousness of self disappears, time awareness dissolves, judgment ceases. These are peak experiences precisely because consciousness temporarily abdicates. The best moments are least conscious moments. The drunk person experiencing decreased self-consciousness reports feeling free. This freedom is release from consciousness's prison. The social lubricant of alcohol is consciousness dampener. We drink to escape being conscious of ourselves. The dying sometimes report consciousness fading peacefully, the return to unconsciousness, the weight lifting, the observer dissolving. If death is unconsciousness, it might be relief from consciousness's burden. The fear of death might be consciousness fearing its own ending. Meditation's goal is often described as consciousness expansion, but might be better understood as consciousness suspension. The quiet mind isn't more conscious, it's less conscious. The peace comes from reduction of consciousness activity, not its increase. Animals don't need meaning, purpose, justification. They exist without existential burden. The dog doesn't wonder why it's a dog. The bird doesn't question whether bird life is worthwhile. Unconsciousness includes natural justification. Consciousness lacks. The fantasy of returning to nature is partly fantasy of returning to unconsciousness. Living simply, without complexity, without endless consciousness of everything, the appeal is regression to less conscious existence. Indigenous cultures, often closer to nature, often report higher happiness despite material simplicity. Maybe reduced consciousness, fewer abstractions, less future orientation, more presence, creates well-being. Modernization destroys. We cannot return to full unconsciousness without death or brain damage. Consciousness cannot be voluntarily abandoned. We're exiled from the unconscious Eden we never knew we were in until we left. The acceptance. Living consciously with consciousness's curse. If consciousness cannot be escaped or transcended, perhaps it can be accepted. Not celebrated, not solved, but accepted as the condition of human existence, simultaneously burden and gift, curse and capability. Acceptance doesn't mean you're happy about consciousness. It means you stop fighting reality. You're conscious. This creates suffering. Fighting this truth creates additional suffering. Acceptance removes the secondary suffering of resistance. The conscious being who accepts consciousness's nature stops demanding consciousness be different, stops trying to perfect consciousness, stops seeking consciousness escape. This doesn't eliminate suffering, but reduces suffering about suffering. Acceptance involves acknowledging consciousness's paradoxes without trying to resolve them. You're conscious, and this creates problems. Consciousness trying to solve consciousness problems creates more problems. Both things are true. The paradox doesn't need resolution. Different wisdom traditions emphasize acceptance over transformation. Stoicism's acceptance of what cannot be changed, Buddhism's acceptance of suffering's inevitability, existentialism's acceptance of meaninglessness. All recognizing consciousness's limitations and working within them rather than fighting them. Acceptance creates space for consciousness's benefits. Yes, consciousness suffers. But consciousness also appreciates beauty, creates art, loves deeply, thinks abstractly, experiences wonder. Accepting the curse means accepting the gift within the curse. The acceptance that consciousness is burden makes consciousness's moments of grace more precious. The sunset's beauty is meaningful precisely because consciousness experiences it. The love's intensity is valuable precisely because consciousness knows its temporary nature. Acceptance means lowering expectations for consciousness. You won't be perfectly present. You won't eliminate anxiety. You won't transcend suffering. You're conscious, which means you're fundamentally limited. This isn't failure. It's honest about consciousness's nature. The person who accepts consciousness's burden stops comparing themselves to impossible standards, stops chasing enlightenment, stops demanding perfect peace, starts accepting actual conscious experience with all its imperfections. Acceptance doesn't mean resignation. You can work to reduce unnecessary suffering while accepting necessary suffering. You can develop practices that ease consciousness while acknowledging consciousness cannot be eliminated. The paradox is that acceptance itself requires consciousness. You're conscious of accepting consciousness. There's no escape from recursion, but perhaps recursion with acceptance is less tortuous than recursion with resistance. Acceptance means recognizing consciousness as double-edged. Awareness enables understanding but creates anxiety. Memory enables learning but creates regret. Imagination enables creativity but creates worry. Every consciousness capacity cuts both ways. The final weight, consciousness, contemplating its own ending. Consciousness's ultimate burden is knowing it will end. The conscious being is aware of its own mortality in ways unconscious beings are not. This knowledge that the consciousness experiencing this moment will cease creates distinctive suffering. Animals die without knowing they'll die. They might fear immediate threats but don't carry awareness of future death constantly. Consciousness's gift of temporal projection is curse of knowing the final endpoint. The consciousness of consciousness ending creates existential anxiety that permeates everything. Every experience is colored by awareness, it's temporary. Every moment is shadowed by knowledge of final moment. Consciousness turns mortality into constant companion. The particular torture is consciousness imagining its own non-existence. You try to conceive of not being conscious and discover you cannot. Consciousness cannot imagine its absence. Only present consciousness imagining absence. The unimaginability creates horror. The dying person experiences consciousness's final burden. Awareness of ending while still aware. Consciousness watching itself dissolve. The self-referential awareness turned on its own termination. This is suffering consciousness created for itself. Different cultures handle consciousness of death differently. Some emphasize afterlife to extend consciousness beyond death. Others emphasize reincarnation to cycle consciousness. Some accept consciousness's ending as natural, but all must address consciousness's awareness of mortality. The horror of consciousness is that it illuminates its own extinction. You're aware that you'll stop being aware. The light knows it will go out. The consciousness knows it will cease. This knowledge is burden unconscious beings never carry. Consciousness creates the fear of death that makes death feared. Without consciousness, death would just be a biological event without psychological dimension. Consciousness transformed simple biological process into existential catastrophe. The final question consciousness faces: was being conscious worth the burden? Was awareness worth the suffering awareness created? Was knowing worth the pain of knowing you'll stop knowing? Each consciousness must answer for itself, knowing the answer dies with them. Perhaps consciousness's ultimate burden is this: carrying the weight of being conscious, unable to escape, unable to transcend, unable to stop being aware of inability to escape awareness, the recursive prison that contains itself. And so we arrive where we began: consciousness as burden, awareness as curse, being human as carrying weight, unconscious. Beings never feel. We cannot unknow what we've known, cannot become unconscious except through death, cannot escape the consciousness that makes us suffer by being conscious of suffering. Maybe this is consciousness's final teaching, that being human means bearing the unbearable weight of awareness, that consciousness's curse cannot be lifted, only lived with, that the question isn't how to escape consciousness, but how to carry consciousness's burden with whatever grace we can manage. The burden remains, the consciousness continues, the weight persists, and we carry it because we must, because we're conscious, because awareness gives us no choice but to be aware of having no choice. This is the human condition. Consciousness conscious of itself, suffering its own awareness, unable to escape, unable to stop knowing. In the end, consciousness might be evolution's cruelest experiment, creating beings capable of knowing they exist, capable of questioning existence, capable of suffering existence, but not capable of escaping existence except through existence's ending. The conscious being is condemned to consciousness until consciousness is condemned to ending. This is the burden. This is the curse. This is consciousness.